Welcome everybody. Hello, hello. So still in a different part of my house, but we should be good by next week, hopefully. The lighting's not as bad today, so hopefully it doesn't throw you off too much. So today we're talking about race and mental health. I'm going to start by doing a lecture on race, the social construction of race. I'm going to move to some racial differences, just drawing broad patterns. And at the end, I will do intersectionality part 1, giving you the tools you need for your assignment this weekend, and then also covering that assignment. So every part of lecture is really important today. So when I talk about minorities, I am talking about non-dominant groups that lack social status and political power relative to the dominant group. I am not talking about, quantitative minorities. So when I say minority, if we're talking about gender, that would be women, gender identity, we're thinking trans people, for example. And so when I say, trans people are the minority or a minority group, like instinctually that makes sense because, they're a generally relatively small population compared to the amount of people who identify as cisgender or not transgender. But if I were to say women are the minority, that can be a bit more confusing because quantitatively women and men in society tend to, be roughly equal, give or take some. And so keep in mind that when I'm talking about minorities, I'm not just talking about, groups that are small in number. I'm talking about groups who experience social marginalization. And so what you're going to notice, and you are probably going to be kind of frustrated if you were like, yay, this is the lecture where I learn like true to form hard lines about which race has schizophrenia the most. Your reading does cover some of that, but what I'm going to talk about today are, again, some overarching patterns and some things that conflict. And so it's really difficult to draw straightforward connections. And so you're not going to be able to leave this lecture knowing, every Black person has this mental health issue and every white person has this mental health issue. It just doesn't work that way. And so the intersectionality is also a big part of it. And I know you don't really know what that means too much, but again, like I said, I will teach you it today. When I say intersectionality, I'm just referring to how we're never just one identity. All of our social statuses, gender, race, sexuality, they all overlap and coexist at the same time. And so again, race, class, gender, within populations, across populations can make it hard to say. So how do I say, women have, if I were to say women are more depressed than men and Black people are less depressed than white people, well, how much more depressed is a Black woman than, a white woman or a white man, for example? And so that's what I mean by intersectionality. I can say, Blacks versus whites, for example, but what about women versus men and queer folk versus straight folk? And then how does that matter? Like, how does that change if you are a queer person of color who was very rich, who was able-bodied, but neurodivergent, but grew, because we have different identities, it's hard to say that this group definitively has this pattern, but we'll try to draw them. There's also heterogeneity across members and among members. So that's going to be a major finding of today that you will keep coming in contact with. When I say heterogeneity, I mean that minority populations are not a monolith. If I say Asians, there might be some images that come to mind, but Asian is a really, really vague word. That most people who Americans would consider to be Asian don't even call themselves Asian. They prefer their ethnic identification. So they would rather say Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Southeast Asian, for example, or even more specific than that. And so when we say things like the Black community, well, what do you mean by a Black community? Are you talking like diasporic community? Are you talking Caribbean Black community? Are you talking recent African migrants? This is not a monolith. So it's hard to say Black versus white, Asian mental health, Latinx mental health, because when we say Latinx mental health, well, Cubans in Florida are having different experiences socially than Mexicans are in LA, for example. And so it's really hard to draw straightforward conclusions because even within groups, there are so many ethnic, gendered, et cetera, differences. And then we also have differences in culture. And so the way that people in different groups express emotions, display emotions, what's acceptable, all of that also varies. And so racism and migration experiences are critical to mental health. This we know, and they need further investigation. And so even though I'm not going to be able to necessarily draw absolute patterns or absolute statements that are like, hard to find and are unwavering, it's absolutely true that racism as well as acculturation and migration experiences do influence mental health. And so the first thing I want to do with you guys is explain how we're talking about race in this class. So race was initially used to refer to domesticated animals, but over time has come to be applied to humans. And so if we think about biological race, because what we have today is social race. What I'm talking about today in this class is social race. The idea of race that people created, that groups of people created. However, there is biological race, and you'll hear people say things like, there's only one race, the human race. And they typically say that in response to the idea that races are, absolute. And so they're not, because biologically we are one race. If we think of, tigers, the Bengal tiger, Siberian tiger, Sumatran tiger, that's what's meant by biological race, mutually exclusive groups. As humans, the races that we speak of, Black, white, Asian, Latinx, these are not mutually exclusive groups in the way that Siberian, Bengal, and Sumatran tiger are. So the everyday way that we use the word race in our society, that's social race. It includes how we identify ourselves, our self-identity, and also how we're identified by others, our social identity. And so a large portion of Americans believe in the biologically distinct races. So up to 3/4 of white Americans believe that race has a biological base, that either you are white or you're not white, that you are born into this race, and that with being born into that race, there comes some biological essentialism. And so you guys are familiar with essentialism from whenever we talked about gender. Gender essentialism is the idea that women are just nurturers naturally. Women are just emotional naturally. Men are just born leaders. Men are just stronger. The idea that you are naturally in a mutually exclusive group, and because you're born into that group, you're born with innate differences. And so we have that with race as well. People believe in biological racial essentialism, the idea that, Black people are just more athletic. Asians are just smarter. White people are just more moral and rational. And so we have upwards of 75% of white Americans who believe that there are innate racial differences, that race is biologically based. However, there are also non-white people of color who also feel this way, although it's much, much, much less. Way more white people believe in biological race than, or believe in a biological basis for race in humans than do people of color. However, characteristics that we perceive as biological can typically be explained away whenever we control for social circumstance. And so what I'll talk to you about in the next few slides is more about how race is socially constructed and the way that sociologists understand race. And so human beings are actually 99.9% identical in terms of nucleotide pairs, which is just one of the building blocks of DNA. And so we are far more identical than any other species. In fact, biologically, because a lot of our biological makeup is also about geography. And so I, as a Black person, could actually be more genetically similar to Donald Trump. So I, as a, queer Black woman, could be more genetically similar to this rich white man, rich white, cis het man, than I could be to a person with the same skin tone as me who lives in a country in Africa. And so and you guys might have heard this before, which is why people say, there's only one race. You are just as likely to be, can be as likely or more likely to be genetically similar to somebody of a different race than you are to somebody who would be race the same as you. So I might be more genetically similar to you, even if you're a different race than me or a different color than me, than I am to somebody who is also Black but lives in France, for example. And so we are very much similar. We have created the idea of race as humans, just like we created gender, we created sexual categories. The way that we as humans, again, I mentioned this on Thursday of last week, I think it was, we as humans are like, we're just like flesh wrapped sacks of blood and bone, honestly. And like at some point in history, some people said, or some persons, well, some people, as I'll explain in a second, some people said, well, we're gonna take these various kind of random characteristics about our fleshy bodies, and we're gonna say, if you put these together, that's a group right there. And so the idea that if you put, if you group hair length and height and hip size, that can tell you whether you're a man or a woman, and that'll determine whether you should work or raise kids. The idea that you can put nose size, hair texture, and skin color together and say you are Black or you are white, and that determines whether you get to live or not. Like, we're not born knowing how to tell race apart. We're taught racial difference. And so what happened is that the assignment of social importance to physical features, because yes, we are physically different. That is true. I also will say that if you were to try to line up every person in the world from lightest to darkest, you wouldn't find that it's, okay, this segment is white and this is Asian and this is Latinx and this is Black. Like, you're going to find light-skinned Blacks and dark-skinned Italians and darker-skinned Asians and lighter-skinned Australians and Aboriginals. And it's not straightforward. There's no reliable way to sort every single person into a race. And you may think, yes, there is. If you go out and your day-to-day life, you probably can, you think you can just group people into different races. But think about the term ethnically ambiguous. Imagine that, again, you went to every country in the world but didn't know what country you're in, and you had to identify where each person was from. You wouldn't be able to do it, because it's actually not that easy. So I'm not saying that there aren't differences in skin color and hair texture. What I'm saying is that the fact that we assign social value to things like melanin count, and whether your hair grows up or grows down, that like whether your hair grows up or grows down determines whether you're professional and should get a job or not. Like, we as humans decided that, dreads are cool and chic, but locks are dirty and unprofessional, for example. And so we have these physical features, but we as humans assigned social importance to this raw, fleshy material that we call our bodies. And this occurred through social relations that brought different populations into sustained contact with each other. So through migration and conquest, so different geographical groups coming into contact with each other through going to different areas or fighting over resources, political challenges against the state. We decided as humans to group these characteristics and then base social worth on them. And it was through different groups in different geographies coming into contact with each other that they began to say, hey, those people have skin that blends in with the nighttime more, or hey, those people have hair that goes down. It was noticing those kind of differences and then saying, oh, well, those flat-haired people aren't good as us. Those, night-skinned people don't deserve to have this crop. But it was because these groups, and we got to think too, we're thinking about geography, and even within these geographical pre-racial groups, there were differences within them as well. But it was because these groups, all of them having, being in groups, they came into contact with other groups through, again, migration, conquest, political challenges. And then because they were competing, they used differences to justify treating each other differently. And so that's why I say that the creation of a social race led to the belief of a biological race. It was only once social importance had been assigned to the physical differences that people began to act on them, that people began to treat members of different groups differently than how they treated people within their own racial group. And so the mistreatment of people of other races really only happens because we've been socialized to believe that there are innate differences. But the belief that there are innate differences came from somewhere. It came from a historical need to separate ourselves into different groups because of migration, conquest, and fighting over resources. However, and again, it's not just one person said, hey, we have race now. This was over time, but we're not born being able, like a child, if you raise a child without teaching them about race, they're not going to know that's a Black person. That's, 4C hair versus having 1A hair. Like they're not going to know. They might notice that their skin is darker or, that their eyes are a different color, but we're taught that the skin color, the eye color, the nose shape, that equals race, and that person's race and determines their worth. We're taught that. So that's what I want you to take away from this. And so whenever we think about racial differences, it's not that I'm telling you about innate biological differences that we're born with. I'm talking about things that over time, over generations, hundreds of years, we've been socialized into. And it replicates. Like it's, still relatively stigmatized for people to date outside their race. Not always, and some groups do it more than others. But it makes sense, we typically date people within our own race. Sometimes even within our own skin color, or complexion, or color. And if you're consistently dating people in your own race, because if you've been socialized into believing that that's the right thing to do because of racial purity and respectability, then yeah, you're going to eventually have people who look more and more like each other because you're only dating within your group. But that group was established long ago socially. So yes, we are kind of self-replicating the difference, but the fact that we see difference at all and that we group these differences into these races, that came socially. We're not born knowing that stuff. So, ta-da, race is a social construct. We can see that just in even the, governmental identification of race. So, race is not something we just talk about socially or for fun. You're asked your race on the census, you're asked your race on surveys, you're asked your race whenever you get your license, your ID, apply for college, apply for a job. And like, yeah, it's voluntary, it's, demographic information, but you're asked it. And when it comes to the census, that's a category that like you're strongly encouraged from kind of all sides to respond to. But if you think back over history, and you might not know this, some of you do, some of you don't. No two government censuses have used identical categories. None. If you're like, oh, there she goes, lying again. I say it every time. Look it up. Challenge me. I'm always here for it. If you go back, the censuses always have different categories. And so whenever you would go back, to the earlier censuses, you might see that all you have is, white and, enslaved, for example. And, you go a little bit longer and then you have like quadroon, octoroon, mulatto. There was a time when Mexicans were grouped as white people. Now we have where Arab Americans are grouped as white people, even though most Americans do not see Arab Americans as being white. A lot of people see Arab Americans as being people of color and of being quote unquote terrorists. That's a narrative that we think of, or not we as in like you and I, but like as our society. But on the census, Arab Americans are white. And so throughout history, our own government has never had two censuses that had the same racial categories. And so in many ways, historical events and political factors play an important role in determining which racial categories are recognized at a given time. And so the fact that we have this switch towards Latinx, from Latino, from Hispanic, we're changing from, Oriental to, Asian, to using specific ethnic identifications, to getting even more specific to, sub-ethnic identifications. That's partially because of the census. And so not only am I giving you evidence that race is something that we've created, but the government's actively creating it because every single census, which is like the government's biggest way of figuring out who we are as a country, they can't even stay on track with racial identification. I mean, the government is literally every single one changing how they talk about race. So even historically, governmentally, there's not been a clear consensus. Race changes. Race also changes geographically, and I mentioned over time. And so domestically, whenever I am back home in Pittsburgh, people typically think that I am biracial. In Pittsburgh, there's a I mean, it's there, but like the areas that like I was born in and raised in, there's not a high population of Latinas. And so when people see me, they assume that I'm a product of what they know the most. And there are a lot of, white people and Black people. And so in Pittsburgh, they think that I am biracial. Whenever I am in Philadelphia, the area that I would frequent, there were a lot of Puerto Ricans. They would assume I was Puerto Rican. Now that I am in Central Jersey, depending on how my hair is, how dark or light my skin is, what time of year it is, how my makeup is done, people think that I'm Dominican. And so literally, I mean, actually, I'll even go more local, even in New Brunswick, depending on how my hair is, how my makeup is, what I'm wearing, I can go outside and on one day, someone will speak to me in Spanish right off the bat because they assume that I am a Latina. And then it could be later that same exact day, maybe I changed my hair a bit, took my makeup off, and they'll talk to me in English. It could be the same exact location. And so even with that, I can go to a different state. I can go to a different city. I can just change my hair and automatically I'm a different race. How can we say that racial categories are absolute, mutually exclusive, innate, and different if just by changing my hair, I can be a totally different race and have a totally different perceived culture? Internationally, I know of people who went on a trip, people, they identify as Black. They're Black in America. Anyone who looked at them for the most part would say that they are Black. Whenever they went to France, they were seen as white. And that might sound so hard for you to understand because how could someone who we would automatically think is Black in America be white in France? Well, because race is not as constant as we think it is. And then historically, think about the one drop rule. So the one drop rule is the idea that, one drop of Black blood is enough to make a person Black. And so think about how we kind of like as a society make jokes or, roll our eyes when a white person says, I'm 1/18th Cherokee, for example. And if you say that, I'm sorry, I'm not picking on you. But like if you ever said that and someone kind of gave you a funny look, it's because now we don't really think that way anymore. To be perceived as Black, you're kind of almost expected to, it's more of a skin thing now than it is necessarily genetics is part of it in terms of like, well, lineage and heritage is part of it, but a lot of how we think of Blackness today is about skin color. And so if there's a white person, blonde hair, blue eyes, raised in suburbia, and they're saying, well, I'm 1/18th Cherokee, therefore I'm a person of color, a lot of people would get really offended by that. If they're a celebrity, they might get like quote unquote canceled. But when the one drop rule was available, whenever we were thinking about, voting rights and voting rights for people who were enslaved at the time, if you had 1/18th Cherokee or 1/18th Black or 1/18th of color of any kind, you were Black. No one would laugh at you. They'd probably say, hey, you don't want to be giving that kind of information away. You better keep it to yourself that you're 1/18th Black. Whereas today, you say that, people are going to laugh at you. And so the way that we determine race, whether it's one drop of Black blood, whether it's about who your parents are, who your grandparents are, what language you speak, when you migrated, whether you're part of the diaspora, how dark your skin is, well, how dark is your skin compared to how long is your hair, and how long is your hair versus how curly is your hair, and like, well, what color are your eyes, and your eyes are this color, so you can't really be Black. And all of that, the fact that it changes so much is more proof that race is a social construct. You can identify a Bengal tiger, a Sumerian tiger, but racially, it's not nearly as clear cut. And across history, and I said, even if I change my hair and go outside, I can be perceived as a totally different race. So race is very much a social construct that we as humans created, and we as humans self-replicate. So what I'm going to do now is just go over some early studies of mental health, and then I'll draw some patterns about, more recent studies on mental health of minorities. So with Black people, early studies were used to demonstrate Black inferiority. Basically, what I mean by that is that early studies of African-American mental health were really only meant to provide scientific rationale for policies of inequality and exploitation. If that sounds like I'm being dramatic, you will probably feel differently in a little bit once I explain the rest of this slide. And so remember, I talked about like we as a people, as a not society, but yeah, we as a race, a human race, really created ways to justify treating people differently. And so the early studies on mental health of Black people were really used to justify treating them bad, to prove that they were mentally disturbed, that they were irrational, that they needed controlling, for example. And so we can think about the reports of a falsified 1840 census. There was a report that falsified data from an 1840 census that showed the further north that Blacks lived in 1840, the higher their rates of mental illness. I'll say it again. A report in 1840 found from the census that the farther north that Blacks lived, the higher their rates of mental illness. And so I ask you, why do you think that finding happened? Okay, I'll give you another example. Drapetomania. I mentioned this actually, I think 2 weeks ago when I talked about cross-cultural differences. I also might have mentioned this, I think like the first day of class actually. Drapetomania, this was a genuine mental disorder. Like it was like psychiatrists were diagnosing this. A mental illness characterized by a desire to escape slavery. The mental disorder is not wanting to be a slave anymore. The psychiatric cure for not wanting to be a slave anymore was to cut off the big toe. The symptom of drapetomania was running away, and the cure was cutting off the big toe. Now I ask again, who does this diagnosis benefit? And then one more, and I'm not going to ask you because I think my point's probably being made at this point. Dysesthesia Ethiopia. This is a mental illness characterized by a desire to avoid work. At the exact same time that we have drapetomania and the falsified census. And so what we have here then is these early studies of African-American health that said, well, they have this disorder and this disorder. Well, all of these disorders, the cures to them were geared towards keeping Black people in slavery. They basically were saying that the more free Black people want to be, the more mentally ill they are. The closer to freedom they are, the more mentally ill they are. And so early studies really focused on reinforcing inferiority. We also had sample sizes were too small. And so if we had studies that were focused on Black people specifically, they were to prove that Black people were inferior. If there were studies that were about the general public, Black people weren't included because they weren't really seen as being a part of the general public. And so many early studies, unless they were trying to exploit Black mental health, many early studies didn't make any special efforts to include Blacks enough to make reliable comparisons. When it comes to Latinx mental health, early studies also didn't provide a clear picture. So we have in 1980, Mexican Americans didn't differ from whites or Blacks on psychological distress at all. 2 years later, actually they have much higher rates of distress. 9 years later, well, actually Puerto Ricans are the ones who have all the distress. 1 year later, actually overall, they all have better mental health than whites. This is a 12-year difference that we have these different findings. And so what we see here is that overall the data is mixed. One reason is that we can't just lump Latinx people all together. Some specific ethnic groups do have higher rates of distress. And so we see that and not even just that, but to think about where distress comes from struggle, turmoil, issues with migration, being criminalized for being an immigrant, having low SES. And so immigrants from Venezuela, Brazil, and Argentina tend to have higher SES than those from Mexico, the DR, and El Salvador. And so because we have, again, this group is not a monolith, and so it's hard to draw a clear picture of Latinx mental health. One, because the studies have been so inconclusive over time, but also because the different subpopulations, the different ethnic groups within the Latinx population have such different histories. When it comes to Asian mental health, again, we don't typically have enough data. Traditional surveys haven't included adequate data to make reliable claims about mental health problems in the Asian community, which is why we have, again, conflicting data. So Asian Americans we have one finding that Asian Americans are underrepresented in clinical populations. Most people think that this means they have lower levels of mental illness. It's not the same thing. It could be that if you have a group that's underrepresented in clinical populations, clinical population just means that they're in treatment. And so this is saying that there are less Asians in mental health treatment. That doesn't mean that less Asians have distress. They could have high levels of distress. They could have higher levels of distress, but for one reason or another, not seek treatment. And so while we do find, and this finding is actually pretty consistent, I will say that Asian Americans tend to be underrepresented in mental health treatment, that's not the same thing as saying that they have less levels of distress, because there are many Asian subgroups and ethnic groups that have higher levels of distress, regardless of, not seeking treatment. Which is why we see that there are some populations that have more mental health problems. And so we have that 20 to 40% of an Asian sample experience psychological distress. So we see that when it comes to level of distress, Southeast Asians, refugees experience very high levels of distress. Japanese and Chinese elderly are more likely to complete suicide than white Americans are. And so if we're talking about seeking help or taking medication, maybe not. But if we're talking about completing suicide, well, maybe you never go to a doctor. Maybe you never take Zoloft or even, do a scale for mental health, but then you still end up completing suicide. So to say that you weren't mentally ill because you never reported as such or attended any treatment might not make as much sense. So again, not fully conclusive. Native American health, we don't know much again. There weren't many early studies regarding the health of Native Americans. So the primary focus has been on substance abuse and high rates of suicide, but we have to keep in mind that it's dangerous to judge populations without considering the socio-historical trauma. And so while there's a high level of stress, if we think about, resources that buffer stress, for example, if we think about healthcare, well, a lot of organizations that cater to Native American healthcare only cater to Native Americans who are on reservations. And I don't know if you guys know what you guys know about Native American reservations, but there's a high rate of violence and frequently from outside the reservation. So the number one cause of death of Native American women is murder. I think about a third, I do believe, I could be wrong, but I think about a third of Native American women have been raped, and most of them by white people, white men specifically, from outside of the reservation. And then if you're not living on the reservation and you're living in a city, then you might have lower SES. It's harder to get to a doctor. And if you go to a doctor, they might not have cultural competency that really speaks to your needs. And so a lot of Native Americans don't really have those buffers against stress. So then we have some recent research. There are 3 large studies that have really helped us know more. The National Comorbidity Survey replication, they didn't oversample minority populations, but it was a national sample. The National Survey of American Life, which is the largest study of Black mental health ever, mostly Blacks and some whites. And then we have the National Latino and Asian American Study, which is the first and most comprehensive national picture of psychiatric disorders for these populations. So this is what we find, and I'm going to ask you some questions. All right, so we find that Blacks, Asians, all Latinx groups except Puerto Ricans have lower rates of disorders than whites. Puerto Ricans have elevated rates compared to all other Latino groups. Vietnamese have lower than other Asian groups, which is interesting because they have lower SES than Chinese or Filipinos. Caribbean Blacks and African Americans have similar rates of mental disorder, but Black Caribbean women have lower rates of disorder than Black American women. But the opposite is true of Black Caribbean and African men. Rates of lifetime and past year disorders for Native Americans range from high to very high compared to other groups, which typically reflects the rates of substance abuse, but those come from different studies. And so if we look at this, what we see is that, again, it's not straightforward. So we can draw general conclusions, but if we look within these groups, I mean, even thinking about, again, class and race and the monolithic perspective, when we talk about Asians, if I talk about, SES of Asians, you might think of like Crazy Rich Asians or like Bling Empire, for example, this idea that, Asians are filthy rich. We've all heard that stereotype. We know the model minority stereotype. However, I want you to think about, and I'm not saying that this is like an absolute, I just want you to think about like the general image that you have come to be socialized around. Who works at nail salons? Who works at dry cleaning facilities? Who runs the hair stores in the like urban areas? And not just urban areas, but like a lot of the hair stores, like, yeah. So think about that. And again, I'm not saying that like all, Asians work in these businesses or like, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, if you think about like the jokes about like who's going to do your nails, the Koreans, who's going to be, owning the hair shops, the braiding shops, well, hair shops for the braiding shops, who's going to be, running the dry cleaners. We don't think about those groups as being rich. So whenever we say, Asians are rich, we're thinking about a very specific subset, a very specific ethnic group of Asians, not all Asians. And so it makes sense that in the same way that we imagine some types of Asians as being doctors and other types of Asians as being in a nail salon, I'm not saying one's better than the other, but in the same way that we think about them differently, it makes sense that they have different experiences. Also, I will say that a lot of the reason that we do see higher SES of Asian immigrants is because they typically had wealth when they entered the country and they had people waiting for them. People who immigrate here and don't have wealth when they come and don't have people waiting for them typically have to go through ethnic enclaves like Chinatown, Little Korea, and tend to actually have less SES. And so a large part of why we do see immigrants who are doing well isn't because they necessarily pulled themselves up by their bootstrap, but typically there is intergenerational wealth and some stability when they already get here. Versus where we see groups who, are more concentrated in nail salons, for example, there tend to be possibly they came here because they were refugees. Not always, but I'm just pointing out that there are very different histories, and it's not just about race, but migration and acculturation is also a huge part of why we see these differences. Okay, so I'm going to stop right there and I'll be right back with your next lecture.